start looking at the interaction between sensory information and perception of that information. So remember that sensory information is just electrical info that's traveling to the brain from a sensory organ in your eyes or your ears or your skin, possibly Golgi tendon organs, muscle sphincters as well. And how does your brain interpret, what's the perception from that signal, and how do those two interact when we're looking at movement skills? All right. So sensation, technically, that term means the activity along the nerve that's triggered by some stimulus in the environment, right? And then that signal is carried to the sensory cortex in the brain, and the brain is going to ignore it, decide to do something about it, right? It may or may not get filtered out and completely ignored. It may be urgent and it may get acted upon. So it depends upon how the brain considers that information that's coming in. Perception then is technically the process within the central nervous system of the brain identifying what that piece of information was and trying to use experience to make some decisions about what to do. All right, so I've got selection, processing, organization. I've got lots of stimuli coming in at the same time. Do any 2, 3, 4 pieces of information all relate to the same thing and give me more information about what I should do in response to that thing? Right. So there's a lot. When we looked back, way back at the beginning of the semester, and we did that very basic info processing. That middle box that was the processing, perceptions going on in there. Okay. So because perception is individual, right? It's one viewpoint, it's not an imagination, it's not abstract, and the brain has this information coming in, it's not projecting something that it's not receiving, all right? So identical sensations then, because they're highly individual, can yield different outcomes, all right? So one of the things we have to be wary of is I can't tell someone else what they see or what color they see, because color is a perception, right? Physically, there's a range, you know, if the light is coming through the air at this speed, you should see something around yellow. But some people are going to see more orange than yellow. Some people are going to see more green than yellow. Okay? My partner and I argue all the time about pinks and purples. Okay? I can't tell someone else what color they see, right? Because that's an individual perception. So when we look at this picture then, some of us see a white vase. Who sees the white vase? You look at it quickly. Who sees two faces? All right. It's exactly the same stimulus to everybody in the class. And yet some of us see one thing, we perceive one shape, and some of us perceive a different shape. Now if you look at it for long enough, and you get enough experience with it, a lot of you can get to the point where you can switch backwards and forwards between two black faces or a white vase. Some people can't actually ever get to that, right? But a lot of people can switch back and forwards if you look at it for long enough. But the important thing is it's the exact same piece of information, and yet some of you saw one thing and some of you saw something else. So, in your experience, you might be able to remember perceiving things or pictures that other people don't perceive. Right? Could be something as simple as looking at a cloud and seeing a dragon. Someone else doesn't see a dragon. It could be more dramatic than that. Right? But perception is highly individual. And there's a very tight link. It's difficult to tease them apart when we're looking at movement. We don't quite know how much influence moving has on perceptual development. Right? We know it's there. We know that once a child starts moving, that helps them develop depth perception, for example. I know that if I want to change my perception of a particular object, we already said that when we're coaching a skill, the best place to stand is at right angles to the plane of motion. Right? Because when I stand at a different angle, the perception of the skill is different. What I see is different. So, most of the literature now, when you look at current work that's going on or recent articles that have been published, look at these as really we have to look at them together. I can't just look at perception or just look at the action in response to the perception. Right? Perception and action are inseparable. We'll talk a bit more when we look at chapter 11, we'll come back and look at that idea. We've got to be able to perceive the environment to move accurately. So this perception is crucial. Right? And the arrow goes both ways. So which one influences the other the most is difficult to tell. So our sensory systems function as individual structural constraints. In that there are receptors, specific cells, that are responsible for triggering the signal to the brain. So in my eyes, there are cells in the back of the retina that have to reach threshold in order to send a signal to the brain that you're seeing something. Okay? And then that means that there could be a structural abnormality that means you don't get a clear signal for some reason. Perception, what's going on in the brain, is typically considered functional. So when you're talking about vision, being able to see something as a constraint, you've got to be able to identify, am I talking about I can't see it because the organ is not working correctly, or am I not perceiving it because my experience is different? So, children, infants, when they're newborn, have some functionally useful vision. Their vision is pretty poor. They can see outlines and kind of identify that this is not the same as this. They don't see details at all well. It's like looking through, imagine it's like looking through a film of water. Nothing's really clear for them. So it really takes a couple of months before they really see you. Okay? You have to get very, very close to them when they're really tiny for them to be able to identify things. So by about 6 months of age, their vision has developed enough that they're able to start to consider locomoting through the environment. Well, that's great because we said that by 8 months, they're starting to creep. So I don't see creeping until they can see well enough to maneuver around in the room. And if they have visual disabilities, then we see creeping later, because seeing things is one of the things that motivates a kid to start trying to creep. Okay. When you get a test on your vision and they give us those numbers, 20/20, that's really what they're measuring is acuity with that number. So acuity is how sharp the object appears to you. And there are 2 forms of acuity. One of them is static acuity, one of them is dynamic. So static acuity is if I'm looking at an object that is stationary, how well do I see the detail in that object? Dynamic acuity is how well do I see detail in an object that is moving. All right, what's the sharpest detail that I can see in that object? And static is simpler, right? Because the object's not moving, so I get a good view of the object. So static acuity develops ahead of dynamic acuity. Okay. But dynamic acuity is really crucial for us in movement because nothing really stands still in sports and movement. Right? So can I see the detail on a cricket ball? Right? If you ask the baseball players or the softball players, how do they know the spin on the ball? Right? What are they looking at to identify spin on the ball? The seam, right? Well, I couldn't even see a seam on the ball. I would just assume it was a smooth ball, right? So, to be highly good at hitting a baseball, I've got to be really good. I've got to have an ability to have very good dynamic acuity. Some of that is genetic, some of that is experience driven. Because if your coach, when you were young, was really good at going, okay, watch for the line. Which way is the line moving? Then you get better at picking that out. Basketball players who have really good field goal numbers have better visual acuity. Okay. So they're able to distinguish the rim very clearly from the backboard, perhaps, while they're moving in a game. So that's an interesting correlation. So if you've got poor eyesight, maybe your field goal numbers aren't as good, but you're better at something else in the game. So, how do we measure? Most of us have had eye tests. You know, now they've got all kinds of clever equipment as well. But 20/20 is really good vision. Babies, see about a fifth of that, right? They're about 2,400 at 4 weeks, and maybe 2030, the development of that acuity, the numbers are a little bit different depending which textbook you're looking at. So don't get too hung up on at what point do they hit 2020. Some kids never hit 2020, first off. Right? And there does seem to be some disagreement amongst the literature. When I look at different motor development textbooks, they all give me a different estimate of the age at which a child would reach 2020 if they had good eyesight. So I think the take-home message is just to go with there's a developmental trend. A young child is unlikely to have as good visual acuity as a slightly older child. And at some point before, I haven't seen anything that suggests you have to wait till puberty. So at some point, quite early before puberty, if they're going to have 20/20 vision, they're there. So they're going to reach maturity in that system before they get to puberty. Okay. As we get older, visual acuity is one of the things that declines quite early on, right? So that might impact my sport performance as I get older, but it absolutely impacts day-to-day living tasks. Right? So if you watch your parents, you're going to start seeing changes in behavior due to this, right? They may start wearing glasses when they never wore glasses. Even if they don't start wearing glasses, you might see them turn a light on when before they never would have turned that light on to do that job, right? So if I'm going to pour rice into a saucepan, I can do that by feel, but it's way easier to turn the light on now. So you might walk around your parents' house this time next year, turning all the lights off in the house. Go, Mom, the electric bill's going to be massive. Turn the light off, right? But we need more light as we get older in order to see the detail in things. So dim environments become difficult to cope with. Glare becomes an issue, so night driving gets difficult. A lot of your parents will get to the point where they say, I don't drive in the dark, unless I absolutely have to. Dr. Drabs won't drive in the dark. I don't drive in the dark if I can't. Glare becomes bad. Right? The lights start to sparkle. Right? Okay, there's a car because I can see lights, but I can't tell where it is because the lights are all sparkling all over the place. And I can't see the detail of the edge of the car to work out how far away it is. So driving becomes uncomfortable. And we avoid it if we can. So that visual acuity can impact, imagine then what the impact is on, if I want to play tennis, we have great tennis courts. And we're lucky we have lights on our tennis courts here. So we've got a group of older adults that like to play tennis on a regular basis out on campus. But at this time of the year, if we didn't have lights out there, they wouldn't be able to play because they can't see the ball well enough anymore, and it impacts their performance and it stops being fun. So having lights available on, if you live in a city and they've got some nice facilities in the park, but the facilities aren't getting used, maybe the suggestion to the city is put in lights and maybe they'll get used more, rather than get rid of them. Right? right? Because their option is probably going to be, well, let's get rid of the facility, no one's using it. So you can use this information as you're working to try to improve the older population's opportunity to move. Some of the visual issues that you will have to deal with, and unfortunately you do see some of these in children as well as in adults, but a lot more in adults. So the top one here, this is normal. This one is glaucoma, and glaucoma is caused by high pressure in the fluid in the eye. And what happens as glaucoma develops is that the individual loses peripheral vision. So when we look at vision as an instrument, you have two separate areas that you take information from, a central field and a peripheral field. So with glaucoma, you start to lose this, but you're okay, you can see things in the middle. Okay. Well, we use peripheral vision a lot when we move around in our environment without realizing that we use it. So when you walk through the door frame, you don't stare at the door frame to make sure that you don't hit the door as you walk through, right? You just walk on through. The only reason you can walk on through is because your brain is processing the information from the periphery that tells it where the door frame is. So it can put you in the right place. So in glaucoma, we lose that peripheral and we can see central. So people who suffer from glaucoma have quite interesting head movements and responses to you, because they have to keep everything in the middle. Right? So if you're throwing a ball at them from the side, they can't see that. So you have to make sure that you're tossing within their central vision to them. Right? If you're talking to them, they're going to make sure that they're face on to you all the time. So you might see them move around more than you would expect them to. Right? One of the scary things for older people who develop glaucoma is that if they're unlucky and it continues to develop, this darkness gets bigger and bigger, it spreads in, and their central vision gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and they end up only being able to see a little bit in the middle, and that's quite scary. The other one we see a lot is ARMD, age-related macular degeneration, and the flip happens here. So in this one, we lose the central, but we can still see peripheral. And that can be quite disconcerting when you're teaching people, because what they'll do is they'll not look at you, right? They keep turning away and looking at you from the side, because they can't see. If they stand right in front of you, they can't see you here. They can only see you here. So they look like they won't look at you. Again, from a movement perspective then, that becomes quite tricky, because now I have to make sure that if I want to walk past things, I know where it is. Right? So the structural constraint changes the movement behavior that you're going to see. Right? Interacts with everything else that's going on, and the movement behavior that emerges is going to be different than what you will see from this person. So someone who has visual problems, some of the things you might see is poor eye-hand coordination. So they go to reach for something and they knock it over, or they miss it completely. Right? Reaching and grasping in people with good vision is a very stable skill. You don't miss it very often. Right? You might choose, if it's a cup of hot coffee, to pay very good attention to reaching and grasping versus a cup of water. because the consequence of missing the cup of coffee is bigger. Right? If you knock that over, you can burn yourself. Plus coffee stains things, so there's a lot more repercussion if I miss. But generally, if you've got good eyesight, reaching and grasping is pretty stable. So for someone who's kind of knocking things over a lot, or they miss, that might indicate that you need to ask them to go get their eyes tested. Right? If you've got a kid in your PE class whose eye-hand coordination when they're reaching for things seems off, then you need to talk to their parents. Squinting. A lot of people with visual problems will squint, because when they squint, the muscles of the eye change the shape of the cornea, and it alters the information hitting the back of the eye and hitting the retina. So sometimes squinting can improve the detail of the information that the person is receiving. Under or overreaching, right? Similar to the eye-hand coordination. Do they continually underreach if you're doing catching with them, or overreach? And unusual head movements. We take our vision very much for granted. When you write in your books or on your notes, right? Imagine, like, mostly we write and we only glance at the paper as we write, but that glance gives your brain heaps of information. Imagine having to do the whole thing with your eyes shut. Right? Anybody still got a checkbook? Guys, you get neat check. Yeah. Checkbooks are good. All right. Try writing your name on your checkbook with your eyes closed. Right? So we take it for granted. We're so visually dominant that if we have decent vision, we just don't think about it. It's not until it starts to go kaplooey, or you come across a child in your class who doesn't have good vision, that you start to pay attention to some of these. We had a kid on the playground actually a couple of years ago whose eyesight he was clinically blind, although he wasn't 100% blind. But he was quite interesting, because he would love to run, and he wouldn't mind trying to hit something if it was on the cone, but he was not interested in trying to catch a ball. It was very hard to get him to try to practice catching, even with noise. You know, if I add noise to the ball, put bells on it, or do something like that, it's still difficult to motivate a child who's got visual problems to move. So the sensory bit is all about the organ, right? All about the sensory receptor and whether that is working correctly or not. Perception, remember that perception is the process of identifying what that information means, right? Selecting which piece of information to pay attention to. But perception means I can perceive space, I can perceive an object, I can perceive movement. We're not born with that ability. That's something your brain learns through experience. So let's think about space first. Okay. As adults, it's difficult to imagine not understanding the space in the room. Because you're old enough to have spent enough time learning that. And it's not a conscious learning, it's your brain learning. Your brain does a lot of subconscious learning that you have no idea is going on. In order to perceive space, which is a 3D concept, right, I have to be able to perceive depth and distance, because the information that I get on my retina is two-dimensional. The only information I get refers to the height of the thing I'm looking at and the width. So the information your brain gets is not three-dimensional, it's only two-dimensional. So your brain has to learn to infer depth based upon the amount of information it's getting. Okay. So in order to see in 3D, which we do, right? At least we think we do, right? I don't get three-dimensional information, my brain interprets 3 dimensions because of the experience that we've had. So I have to learn about depth and distance first. Depth perception information comes from retinal disparity. And retinal disparity is the term for the fact that our right and left eyes are spread wide apart on our face, in our skull, and our brain therefore gets different pieces of information from our right eye and our left eye. So pick a spot in the room to look at and close one eye. Put your hand over one eye and stare at that spot. Right? And as you're staring at it, close that eye, cover that eye, and look through the other eye. What happened to the spot you were looking at? Sorry? It shifted, right? It shifts. Because our eyes are spread very far apart, we've evolved with our eyes spread way apart in our head. So what our brain gets is 2 pieces of information. Right? Here's my object. Here's my face. Right? My brain gets 2 pieces of information. And then it fuses those pieces of information back into something that looks 3-dimensional. So retinal disparity, there's 2 different pieces of information from both eyes, is one of the tricks that your brain uses to help learn about distance and depth. Motion parallax is where is the object on my retina. So when the ball moves through the air, as the ball moves, the picture on the retina changes. So your brain gets a sequence of stimuli from different retinal cells telling it that the ball is moving across the field of vision. Optic flow is the change in the pattern as you move forwards and backwards. So the pattern of where it's hitting on my retina changes as I get closer to something and as I get further away. So your brain takes all that information, which is all 2D, and it puts it all together and allows you to see in 3 dimensions. You know there's a back, you know there's a front, you know there's a behind. Why do you know there's a behind? You can't see the behind. Right? With Kim Kardashian, we can probably see the behind, right? Because it's not here, but the rest of us can't see our behind. Very strange bodies, those ladies. Very strange. I would like half their booty. I don't know that I want it. I could stick a wine glass on it. You walk around. Anyway. What do you do day to day? Right? Even outside of your physical activity, your exercise, your sport, what do you do day to day that relies on perception of space? Drive, walk, right? Eat. I've got to be able to put my fork on the thing that's on the plate, right? All of that involves understanding depth and the distance that you are from the object that you're trying to consider. When we're born, we have the mechanical instruments in place to understand retinal disparity and motion parallax, right? But it takes a lot of practice for the brain to interpret what that information that's coming in means. So by about 6 months, the research said, well, we can run little tests on these babies, and we see that by about 6 months, they're starting to have an idea of what depth means. Right? And then that progresses. Once they start locomoting, we see big leaps in their understanding of depth. By adolescence, so early teenage, depth perception is pretty adult-like. As we get older, then lab test for depth perception gets worse and worse and worse. Right? Your scores, when you go to the eye guy and they start to do all their clever stuff, not just get you to read the letters, gets worse and worse as you get older. That's not the next thing I want you to have. All right, so see if I can find this. There's research that we call visual cliff. Where is my piece of video? So visual cliff research that. That's too small. So visual cliff is a research tool that they use with young children, with young babies, to work out this idea of depth perception and the development of depth perception. So they have a glass table, and under half the table they have this checkerboard box, and on the other half of the table the checkerboard is only on the floor. And they put the baby on the table, and what you see is that a child who either is not quite creeping, but maybe they're crawling, or they're cruising, or they've just started hands and knees creeping, will go on the table and go straight across the top of the table to mum. Because they don't notice the fact that the checkerboard dropped down from the tabletop to the floor. Give them a couple of weeks of creeping, And what you see when you put them on the table is, whoa! and they'll go to, and they'll kind of, and they'll look at mum, and mum's shaking the toy, and they look down, and they'll get quite upset. So then, depending upon the child, we either get tantrum and tears, or I saw a piece of video one time at a conference that was brilliant, and the child looked at mum, and it looked at the edge of the table, and it went over to the edge of the table, and it held on, and it crept along the edge of the table to get round to mum to get the toy. Right? There was no way they were crossing over the edge of this cliff. Right? That very strongly then indicates that the practice of creeping helped the brain learn depth perception. Right? Because when they first start, they don't do that. It's only after a couple of weeks that we start to see that behavior happen. Right? So, by the time they're crawling pretty well, they've learned. It doesn't take the brain very long to learn this. Which is nice, means you don't have to worry about the stairs in your house because they're unlikely to go head first down the stairs once they've been creeping for a couple of weeks. Right? You only have to watch them for the first few weeks, because after the first few weeks they're going to get to the top of the stairs and they're going to go, and they're going to do something else. They might go down backwards, they might go down the stairs, right? But they're unlikely to go head first down the stairs, which is quite beneficial, really. Okay. All right, so. Alright. So, perception of space needs depth and distance. The perception of objects, again, as adults, we completely take for granted. Right? You look at a coffee mug, and it clearly does not look like a wine glass. So, how you reach for the coffee cup, how fast, how much force, how careful you are, is very different to how you would reach for a wine glass. Because if you grab the wine glass too hard, it could snap. So as an adult, we don't think about that. You just do. Right? You alter force production. You alter speed, you do all these things. Your hand position, depending upon what it is you're reaching for, is going to be different. All because your brain can identify the thing you're trying to pick up. But again, that took learning. That's not something we're born with. So when we look at an object, remember our haptic perception idea, right? We said there are characteristics of an object that I have to touch the object in order to find out. Right? When we look at objects, we want to know their size, their shape, and whether they're moving, particularly when we're looking at games and PE and sport. Typically, then, our visual perception is based upon our identification of the edge of something. So I can see a ball move because I can identify the edge of the ball against the background and I can tell it's moving. So we assign these boundaries to an object. The ball's round, here's the outside of the ball. If the thing behind the ball is changing, then the ball must be moving. And that helps us to distinguish figure ground and discern the difference between figure ground. Can I pick out an object against the background? Right? Figure ground perception is one of the factors that they think plays a role in home advantage when you're looking at sports, because you practice in the environment, in your own home environment, and so you're very used to picking out